People often assume that being a victim is something no one would ever choose. It's associated with weakness, loss, and suffering. On the surface, it seems like a role everyone is trying to escape, but reality is more complicated than that. Because beneath conscious intention, there are psychological patterns that make victimhood feel strangely appealing, not in an obvious way, not as a goal someone openly admits, but as a subtle identity that offers something the mind quietly values: control, validation, and protection. The idea that someone would want to be a victim sounds uncomfortable because it challenges a deeply held belief that people always want empowerment. But the truth is, empowerment comes with responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. It requires action, accountability, and the risk of failure. Victimhood, on the other hand, offers something different. It removes the burden of responsibility and replaces it with explanation. Instead of asking, "What can I do now?" the mind asks, "What was done to me?" That shift may seem small, but it changes everything about how a person interacts with reality. From a psychological perspective, this pattern often begins with real pain. No one starts by pretending to be hurt. The initial experience is usually genuine: rejection, betrayal, neglect, unfair treatment. These events leave emotional marks that shape perception. The brain is designed to remember pain more strongly than pleasure because pain signals danger. When something hurts deeply, the mind tries to learn from it. It builds protective narratives to prevent the same experience from happening again. But sometimes, those narratives become too rigid. Instead of helping a person adapt, they begin to define the person entirely. A single experience of betrayal can slowly evolve into a belief that people cannot be trusted. A moment of rejection can become a story about not being worthy. Over time, these beliefs stop being temporary interpretations and start becoming identity. And once something becomes identity, the mind begins protecting it, even if it causes harm. There is also a powerful social component to victimhood that is rarely discussed openly. Society often responds to victims with attention, sympathy, and support. These responses are not wrong. They are part of human empathy, but they create a psychological reinforcement loop. When someone expresses pain and receives care, the brain registers that pattern. Pain leads to attention. Attention feels good. This does not mean people consciously fake suffering. It means the mind learns that certain expressions of identity bring connection. And connection is one of the strongest human needs. Over time, some individuals begin to associate their worth with their wounds. Their struggles become the primary way they are seen and understood. Letting go of the victim identity then feels like losing visibility. If I am no longer the one who was hurt, who am I? That question can be more frightening than the pain itself. Another layer to this dynamic is the concept of control. Ironically, being a victim can create a sense of psychological control in an unpredictable world. When life feels chaotic, having a clear narrative about who is responsible provides structure. It simplifies complexity. If something goes wrong, there is already an explanation. Someone else is at fault. The world is unfair. The system is broken. These narratives reduce uncertainty, and the human brain prefers certainty, even if it is negative. Uncertainty requires constant adaptation. Certainty, even painful certainty, allows the mind to rest. This is why some people resist alternative perspectives that challenge their victim narrative. Accepting a more complex view would mean reintroducing uncertainty, and with it, responsibility. It would require asking uncomfortable questions, like, "What part did I play?" or "What can I change?" And those questions do not always have easy answers. There is also an emotional protection mechanism at work. Victimhood can shield a person from deeper feelings of shame or inadequacy. It is often easier to believe that life is unfair than to confront the possibility of personal limitations or mistakes. This does not mean the pain is not real. It means the interpretation of that pain can serve a defensive function. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as self-serving bias, the tendency to attribute negative outcomes to external factors while preserving a positive internal self-image. In moderation, this bias protects self-esteem, but when it becomes dominant, it prevents growth, because growth requires acknowledging areas where change is possible, and that acknowledgement can feel threatening to the ego. The victim identity, in contrast, offers emotional safety. It says, "You are not the problem," And while that message can be comforting in the short term, it can also become a barrier in the long term. Cultural and social environments can further reinforce this pattern. In some contexts, narratives of victimhood are amplified and rewarded more than narratives of accountability. This creates a subtle incentive structure. People learn which stories receive attention and which ones are ignored. Over time, this shapes how individuals present themselves and interpret their experiences. It is not about deception, it is about adaptation to social feedback. If vulnerability expressed as victimhood consistently brings support, while expressions of responsibility are met with indifference, the mind will naturally gravitate toward the former. This does not make someone manipulative, it makes them human, but it does create a dynamic where the identity of being wronged becomes more stable than the identity of being capable. One of the most important psychological concepts related to this topic is learned helplessness. When individuals experience repeated situations where their actions do not seem to change outcomes, they may begin to believe that nothing they do matters. This belief reduces motivation to try. It creates passivity. But beyond behavior, it also shapes identity. A person may begin to see themselves as someone to whom things happen, rather than someone who influences outcomes. This shift is subtle but profound. It changes how opportunities are perceived. It changes how challenges are approached, and it reinforces the victim mindset because every new difficulty becomes further evidence that effort is pointless. Breaking out of the cycle requires not just external change, but a fundamental shift in perception. And that shift is often uncomfortable because it challenges deeply ingrained beliefs about the self. It is also important to understand that victimhood can provide a sense of moral superiority. If someone has been wronged, they may feel justified in their anger, their resentment, or even their inaction. This creates a psychological position where they are not only hurt, but also right. And being right can be addictive. It reinforces identity, it provides clarity, but it also creates rigidity. Because if you are always right, there is no need to change. The world becomes the problem, not you. This dynamic can be observed in many areas of life, from personal relationships to larger social conflicts. Each side sees itself as the victim, and therefore as justified. And when both sides hold that belief, resolution becomes difficult, because neither is willing to step out of the role. At the same time, it is crucial to draw a clear distinction. Understanding the psychology behind victimhood is not the same as blaming people for their pain. Many individuals have experienced real harm, real injustice, and real suffering. Their experiences are valid. The issue is not the existence of pain. It is what happens after, whether that pain becomes a starting point for growth or a fixed identity. Pain can be a teacher, but it can also become a cage, and the difference often lies in how the mind chooses to interpret and respond to it over time. The transition away from a victim mindset does not happen instantly. It requires a shift from external focus to internal agency. This does not mean ignoring external factors or pretending that everything is within personal control. It means recognizing where influence exists and choosing to act within that space. It involves asking different questions, not just why did this happen to me, but what can I do next? That shift reintroduces uncertainty, but it also reintroduces possibility, and possibility is the foundation of growth. One of the most challenging aspects of this transition is letting go of the benefits that victimhood provides: the attention, the validation, the sense of certainty, the emotional protection. These are not trivial things. They fulfill real psychological needs. Releasing them can feel like stepping into emptiness. It requires building new sources of identity and connection. It requires finding value not in what happened, but in what can be created moving forward. And that process takes time. In the end, the question is not whether people want to be victims in a conscious sense. Most do not. The question is whether certain psychological patterns make victimhood feel safer, more rewarding, or more stable than the alternative. And in many cases, the answer is yes. But safety is not the same as growth. Stability is not the same as freedom. The victim mindset offers a way to make sense of pain, but it can also limit what comes next, because as long as identity is anchored in what was done to you, it becomes difficult to fully engage with what you can do. And perhaps the most important realization is this: letting go of the victim identity does not erase the past. it redefines its role. The past stops being the foundation of who you are and becomes one part of a much larger story, a story that is still being written.